The nation has seen an intensifying of gun violence in the last 30 years. While overall crime rates continue to plummet, the scary rise of mass shootings in all facets of public life has forced us to ask what we can do to stem this cycle of violence. CCM recently brought forth a series of recommendations at the state capitol as one piece of the puzzle. And today we are joined by Jeremy Stein, Executive Director of Connecticut Against Gun Violence, to talk about what gun violence is and what can be done about it. We'd like to thank our sponsors at Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders. Jeremy, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
February 1993 is kind of an important date in the founding of your organization 30 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about Connecticut Against Violence, and how did you start? For instance, who was Carol Layton?
Sure. So we are an organization that started in 1993, 30 years ago. And our mission is very simple. It's reduce gun violence in the state of Connecticut. And the way that we started was, not that dissimilar from a lot of other organizations. It was about a couple of people who got together, who saw that there was an injustice in the world and wanted to do something about it. And so in this particular case, 1993, we're talking the height of gun violence in Connecticut and around the country. We're seeing gun wars, drug wars. We're seeing gun homicides, and really the start of this public health crisis. And what ended up happening in Bridgeport, in addition to it being just a horrible year for gun violence, a stray bullet killed a young girl, and she happened to be on a school bus when this happened, and two women got together in their kitchen, and they decided that they wanted to do something more to try to put an end to this senseless gun violence. So they created this organization literally in their kitchen. They decided that they wanted to try to advocate for stronger gun laws in Connecticut and around the country. And then they got 10 of their other friends and formed Connecticut Against Gun Violence. Now we have over 100,000 people who help to support and advocate for stronger gun laws. And we've been very successful over the last 30 years.
So you've grown, it looks like you've grown out of the kitchen, certainly.
Certainly grown out of the kitchen. But it, I like to tell that story because it does show that, anyone is possible of creating change. It could just be one person with a drive. It could be two people like our organization with the desire to make change in their world and their community. And I think it's really important to note that it doesn't have to be this huge movement to start, but that you can grow it. You can grow this grassroots idea of making sure that people are safe in their homes and their communities.
Yeah. It sounds like a silly question, but I'm going to ask anyway. What is gun violence? It's not just one thing. It could be many different things. So how do you define it and how do you look at it?
So there's many different forms of gun violence. And I think, when we talk about gun violence as a whole, like we often talk about it as if it were one thing, right? But it really isn't. It's many different things, right? There is certainly community level gun violence that we see. These are the shootings that we see in Hartford and Bridgeport and New Haven, and shootings that mostly affect Black and brown communities. And in Connecticut, on average, someone is shot every day, and every other day someone is killed on average in Connecticut. But a large part of that is also suicides, and that is typically 2/3 of all gun violence in the country and in Connecticut. And so when we take the number of homicides, typically we can just double that number, and that's the number of people that are taking their own life with a firearm. This is something that's very intimate for me and my family. My uncle, who was a veteran, took his own life with a firearm. But in addition to those types of gun violence, there's also domestic violence. There's also accidental deaths, and each one of these types of gun violence may have a different solution. The one thing that is consistent throughout, whether we're talking about mass shootings in school or school shootings, mass shootings, suicide, accidental deaths, the one consistent is it's just too easy to get access to a firearm in the United States. And you might hear, people say all the time, well, it's mental health, it's mental health. These people are committing this. But the United States doesn't have any greater mental health problem than any other country in the world, right? What we do have is way more guns than any other country in the world. The other thing to note is that people with mental health problems, and there are a lot of people with mental health problems, most people with mental health problems are not going to harm other people. They're actually more likely to be a victim of violence than they are to be perpetrators. And that's the one thing that we need to make sure that we're always pointing out. We're not demonizing people with mental health problems, that we're not creating greater stigma. It is about the guns. It's about access to firearms.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the old refrain, guns don't kill people, people do. But for gun violence to happen, obviously, you need both. You need a gun and the person to pull that trigger. Do you think there's ever a way to solve the totality of gun violence without looking at both weapons and people?
Well, I mean, certainly, that phrase is a ridiculous one, because it's people with guns that kill people with guns, right? And also, the military and the police and certainly citizens spend a lot of money every year buying guns. And if it wasn't about guns, then what are we really talking about here, right? But the idea is that it's not just gun manufacturing and ownership that's the problem. It's not just people, that are the problem. It's the fact that people can get access to guns very easily. Now, in Connecticut, we've done a fantastic job of creating a lot of life-saving laws that try to limit or at least make it reasonable to own a gun, right? And so what do we require here? We require permits. And in order to get a permit, you have to have a background check. So the police have to do a screening to make sure that you're not a danger to yourself or others, that you don't have an illegal purpose in mind, that owning this gun, and you're not going to go out and commit armed robbery the next day, or harm yourself, right? You have to have training in order to get a gun in Connecticut. And there's an age restriction. You have to be 21 to have a handgun, or 18 for a long gun. And then when you buy a gun, you have to have another background check done. So there's checks and balances. We also limit what types of guns you have. We ban assault weapons. We ban high capacity magazines. We require safe storage. So, the analogy I like to draw a lot is with motor vehicles, right? And the way that motor vehicle death, up until recently was the leading cause of death of children. Now it's guns, right? But motor vehicle accidents were responsible for a lot of deaths in the United States. And so what did we do as a country to make it safer, right? So we made cars safer. We put airbags in cars. We required seatbelts to be worn. We put speed limits. We made the roads safer. We have police officers that stop and enforce the laws. All of these things, created a safer world for us to make it so that the car was less lethal, right? And we train people how to use it. So that same thing should apply to anything else that's dangerous in this world, and it should apply to guns as well. We should regulate it. We should train people. We should make them as safe as we can, while still recognize that these things are weapons. They are made to kill. The whole purpose of the gun is to kill, right? And so I think that making sure that we don't allow this constitutional right to be the cause of the death of most Americans, I think it is reasonable to make sure that we have safeguards in place.
Let's talk about some of the ways that Connecticut Against Violence has gotten involved in some of the issues here. Can you talk about what the Extreme Risk Prevention Order is, which has been noted as one of the first, if not the first, of its kind in the nation?
Yeah, so after the Connecticut lottery shooting, which, was a mass shooting in Connecticut, disgruntled
Mhm.
employee with mental health problem comes back to his work where he had just been fired and tries and kills a lot of people
Mhm.
with firearm. And there were reports by the police prior to this happening. There were complaints that this person might pose a threat. And at
Mhm.
that time, the police felt that they didn't have the ability to remove the guns from his possession
Mhm.
because he hadn't committed a crime yet. And so after that shooting, what they developed was the world's first, the country's first, what is now known as extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws, but what we call in Connecticut the risk warrant,
Mhm.
and or the risk protection order as it's now called, which are two separate things, which I'll explain.
Mhm.
But the idea is that in an emergency situation where someone is at imminent risk to harm themselves or others,
Mhm.
the court can issue an emergency order to remove the guns from the possession of somebody that might cause the next mass shooting
Mhm.
or might harm themselves. And to be able to get the guns out of the hands of that person creates cooling down period. It
Mhm.
creates a way to get that person help. It creates a way to have the police intervene or family members intervene um, without having this, and making sure that this person doesn't have possession of a firearm, which
Mhm.
ultimately could result in the death of a lot of people or themselves. And
Mhm.
so this is a law that has been used a lot. It has been studied, and it is widely viewed as being one of the most effective gun violence strategies, especially to reduce suicide.
Mhm.
Um, and so, this is also a law that does have a lot of due process.
Mhm.
It's very similar to the way that the police would obtain a search warrant for a house,
Okay.
right? So there are safeguards in place. It's not just somebody shows up and says they want to remove guns. They have to typically they go to the police. The
There is
police
a
then
process the
fill
police
out
has
an
to go through.
right, and then police fill out an affidavit or they appear before a judge. They swear
Mhm.
before a judge and they give evidence just like they would in a search warrant or an arrest
Mhm.
warrant. And then the judge has to weigh the evidence and decide whether or not there's exigent circumstances, whether it's warranted, and then they will issue an emergency order to remove the guns. And then
Mhm.
after that's done, the gun owner does have a right to have a hearing.
Mhm.
I believe it's within 14 days. And then there'll be an evidentiary hearing to decide whether or not that order should continue. But
Mhm.
in the meantime, they've removed the guns from an extremely dangerous situation.
Mhm.
And it has been studied, and for every they say every 5 to 10 times this is utilized, it saves
Mhm.
a life.
Yeah.
So over the years, it's been used thousands and thousands of times. I think over the last 10 years, it's been used close to since 1999. It's been between 1999 and 2020. It's been
Mhm.
used over 2,000 times, which means they've probably saved at least 200 lives as a
Yeah.
result of this. And that's a 200 lives is about the same number of people that die every year from suicide by
Yeah.
gun.
That's
So
really cool that that program seems to be working and really saving lives. So you said that there's a process for the owners to go in and appeal it. So like if they whatever, for instance, maybe what they're going through, they're doing better or whatever, they could go in and appeal it to maybe get their firearms back eventually.
yeah, absolutely. And there is provisions. Actually, the law was just amended, I believe it was last year, to be able to allow family members, mental health providers, and medical providers to be able to petition the court themselves to get a police investigation to be performed.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times these are the people that are seeing it happen
Hmm.
firsthand. Doctor may be treating a patient who says they're suicidal, or a psychologist may treat one of their patients that says, I'm planning on shooting up a school, and
Hmm.
what can they do? And certainly the best thing they should do is to go to the police first, but for whatever reason, sometimes people don't feel comfortable going to the police,
Hmm.
or maybe the police decided they weren't going to investigate for whatever reason. So it does create another avenue to
Hmm.
allow this law to be utilized. Once again, still safeguards in place, still has constitutional safeguards and due process in place. But yes, it does provide a provision where the gun owner can petition the court early
Hmm.
and say, that they no longer suffer from exigent circumstances, and they no longer are having problems, or they got help, or
Mhm.
they're in treatment, or whatever it is. But yes, they can apply to get this, to get their guns back. But the reality is that most of the time this is utilized.
Mhm.
Most of the time where the police have to intervene, the gun owners cooperate. I
Yeah.
mean, this, and they voluntarily give up their guns in most
Mhm.
cases where the police are intervening. And many of these cases where there is, even though there is a hearing that's guaranteed within 14 days, sometimes that hearing is often waived,
Mhm.
to allow more service to be put in place, or to allow the person to get an attorney, or to, so it's not, I know the other side likes to complain that there's no due process, but there
Mhm.
actually is many um, protections.
Mhm.
The main thing is that we want to make sure that people, citizens, family members, children
Mhm.
are protected first,
Yeah.
right? That we want to make sure that the next Sandy Hook doesn't happen.
Mhm.
So it's very, very widely utilized in Connecticut, but also it is a law that is has been passed in many different states.
Mhm.
And
Was it largely
it's
kind of
about,
modeled after Connecticut's laws?
it is modeled after Connecticut's laws, but it was really California that kind of
Mhm.
modernized it.
Okay.
Um, and um, Connecticut and Indiana have very similar laws, and they're the more modern version of the extreme risk protection order is one
Mhm.
that goes through the civil courts,
Okay.
whereas Connecticut's is actually a criminal procedure, or
Okay.
quasi-criminal procedure. So it actually is the state's attorneys that
Mhm.
present the case to the court in cases in Connecticut, whereas in other states it's more of like a civil protective order.
Mhm. Do you think Connecticut eventually will kind of go towards that other style, or does ours seem to work for us?
I think that when they modernized it a couple of years ago,
Mhm.
when the law was expanded to allow family members,
Mhm.
physicians, and mental health providers, I think that was a way to make it more similar to other states.
Kind of
But
address some of those maybe issues that the newer ones had fixed.
exactly, and I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of places where there are, certainly some people just don't want to walk into a police station for whatever
Mhm.
reason. Maybe they've had bad experiences with police, or they don't
Mhm.
just trust they don't trust the police. But for whatever reason, we don't want that to be an impediment for people getting
Mhm.
help, right? We want to make sure that people get help as quickly as possible. But Connecticut's risk warrant works very well. And like
Mhm.
I said, it is, even though physicians can get access to this, can petition the court directly, it
Mhm.
is ultimately the police that could probably do this quicker, right? They can
Yeah.
navigate through the court system quicker. They're certainly the most equipped to remove a gun from a dangerous
Mhm.
situation. And also they can get access to the courts quicker. The public,
Mhm.
if something happens on a weekend, police can probably get access to a judge
Mhm.
very quickly, whereas you and I aren't going to be able to get hold of a
Yeah.
judge on Saturday or Sunday. So ultimately, I do think that because Connecticut's system works so well, I don't think there is a real desire to switch it from a
Mhm.
quasi criminal to a civil process. But certainly those, I think it state depends on the state
Mhm.
which you use. I mean, there's advantages for making it civil, there's advantages for making it criminal. Um, and I think it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM. In your time of leadership, we looked on your website, we see that you've helped with the passage of 4 gun laws in just 2 years, 3 of which took place in 2019 alone. What were those bills, and how do you galvanize support for these issues?
Yeah, so since taking over in this organization, which and I definitely stand on the shoulders of many other executive directors in this
Yeah.
organization who've done tremendous amount of work getting us where we are today. Ron Pinciero was my predecessor, who did incredible work before Sandy Hook and during Sandy Hook, and since then. And since 2018, there's been about 6 gun laws that have passed,
Mhm.
and some of those laws are safe storage. Ethan's law was one of the laws that we helped pass, and that is, really a one of those laws that we're not trying to take guns away from anybody, like it is about responsible gun ownership, right? If your gun isn't on you and you're not using it, especially if you have children in the home, it should be locked up. Most gun owners do this anyway, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be mandated. And then for those people who aren't going to be responsible, and that are causing more gun violence, whether it's by leaving guns in cars unattended and then those cars are being broken into, or sometimes those cars aren't even being locked. And then what happens to those guns? Well, they end up in our cities, right? And then those guns are being used for the commission for commission of crimes. Yeah. And, so the idea of these laws are, let's make irresponsible gun owners held responsible. Let's make sure that they're held accountable, especially if they're contributing to more gun violence in our cities, or suicide or accidental death, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So people should be held accountable if they're not going to be responsible. So safe storage is one of those laws. It had overwhelming bipartisan support, Ethan's law. And to briefly tell you the story, Ethan was a teenager who was over his neighbor's house, and they got access to the neighbor's father's gun. It was under his bed. The ammunition was right next to the gun. It wasn't locked. They were playing with the gun, and it went off, and Ethan was killed.
In Connecticut.
And this was in Connecticut. This was in Guilford. This was in Guilford, Connecticut. And Mike and Kristen Song have been very active and very vocal about championing the issue of safe storage in this country. And then, this was a bill that had almost unanimous support. I mean, across the aisle support for something as simple as safe storage. And now we're looking to expand that even more. Right now, we have a law that only requires you to lock up guns if you have a child in the home or a prohibited person. And really, it should be more similar to what Massachusetts has, which is if you have a gun, you should keep it locked up, unless it's on you, unless it's in your control, it should be in a safe. There's no reason why, if you're going on vacation, to Europe, and your guns should, you're right, it shouldn't be lying on the counter. We also hear all the time, people call us all the time where, hey, I'm divorced and my estranged husband lives, across town, and my 19-year-old son who has mental health problems is visiting his father, and the father likes guns and he doesn't lock it up, but my child resides with me, but he doesn't, but he visits the father, and so these are situations where, adults, but young adults, and maybe some with mental health problems, are having access to firearms. And there's no reason why in that situation, why that person shouldn't lock up the guns, regardless of whether children's in the house, whether somebody resides there or not. People should just get into the practice of locking up their guns when they're not in use. There's really no reason. And there are plenty of safes right now where you can use biometric measures, just like your cell phone. Open up a safe in a matter of a second or less than a second.
So it can read your fingerprint now. You don't have to remember the combination and put it in.
Exactly. Or it's a series of hand touches, right? And it's not even numbers. And they do have combination locks. But there's many versions of these things. They operate by magnetic lock with a ring, or now I think they're developing RFI technology where it's radio frequency, but many versions of locking up your gun where you can still get very quick access to a firearm if you need to. So really isn't something that is going to prevent you from having a gun and getting access to it if you need to protect yourself in your home. And you can have both. You can have safe storage and also have access. Now
you don't have to choose one or the other. You can have quick access to your gun while still keeping it safe and secure.
Exactly. And it's a trade-off. Look, if you really want quick access to your gun, the only way to really make sure that you always are going to have quick access is to carry it on your hip and have it loaded at all times, which is ridiculous, right? And if somebody has to live with that sense of fear all the time, right, then there's something more going on. You've got bigger problems if you feel like you have to have a gun on you at all times, and so there's other things that you can do to secure your home, alarm system, having a dog,
Yeah.
like making sure your windows and doors are locked, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, safe storage is one of those laws that we passed. We're looking to strengthen it. Some of
Mhm.
the other laws that have passed in the past, where as I said earlier, we strengthened our extreme risk protection order. Um, we we also helped to create, a couple of years ago, the first commission on community violence intervention and prevention, and this
Mhm.
is a grant source within DPH, that has been funded with $2.9 million to
Mhm.
invest in community-based organizations that are doing community violence intervention, prevention, and
Mhm.
aftercare services in places like Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven. And we felt like this was one of the most important initiatives that, there is a lot of attention on these mass shootings, and sometimes
Mhm.
we do forget about the bigger numbers, which is community gun violence and suicide. And that's really
Mhm.
where attention should be spent. And so, one of the best ways to reduce community gun violence is to make sure that we are utilizing evidence-based, community-based organizations
Mhm.
that are like boots on the ground and that are doing work in their community, to try to prevent the shootings from happening in the first place.
Noted in the introduction to the podcast, but has been a rise in gun violence in the last couple of years here. In one article that we distributed, it's been noted that just in the month of January, we're on pace as a country to get to over 600 mass shootings in the United States again. As an organization, what are some of the causes that you have noticed that led to this increase? Is it, partly tied to the pandemic, economic disparities, ghost guns? What do you see as some of the causes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a simple answer. I think it's all of what you just said. I think that certainly we can see that the pandemic played a part in increasing gun violence.
Hmm.
And so, just if you look at gun violence as a public health crisis, which is what it is, right?
Hmm.
And what has happened over the last couple of years is, between the ages of 18 and 34, guns are the leading cause of death of people, people between the ages of 18 and 34, leading cause of death in children, and surpassing cancer and car accidents. Right
Yeah.
now, it's guns, and we saw a dramatic rise in gun sales over the pandemic. Also,
Hmm.
we also saw a decrease in services and a decrease in employment.
Yeah.
And so, what happens is when you've got any public health crisis and you increase mental health issues, right? People are dealing with a life and death situation,
Hmm.
right? COVID. And then you remove quality of life, right?
Hmm.
So you take, reduce employment, increase unemployment, reduce, close community centers, close
Hmm.
schools, reduce the number of mental health services available, things like that. You're going to see a dramatic increase in any type of violence, and certainly that it can be argued that played a factor in gun violence
Hmm.
as well. I remember, living in New York City. I was a lifeguard as a kid,
Hmm.
and I remember one year they decided, for a funding reason, that they were going to close a pool in an area where there was a lot of crime, an
Hmm.
area called Park Hill, and I remember they closed the community pool in that area. And that summer, it was one of the hottest summers, and also
Hmm.
it was one of the most violent summers.
Yeah.
And I think there, what experts came to determine was they needed to reopen community centers and pools and things like that and give resources to communities.
Yeah.
You take away these types of things, you're going to increase the chances of any type of violence. And certainly, if you have a situation where you've already increased violence and now you're going to add into this powder keg an increase in the purchase of firearms and availability of firearms,
Hmm.
then you're going to see an increase in gun violence. I think it was John Hopkins University that said, that studied this years ago, and they've continued to study it. But any given area where you add more guns, like the idea of more guns, is equal to more gun deaths. So anytime
Hmm.
there are more guns, you're going to see more gun death. And so and Connecticut is no exception to that.
Hmm. Like it just holds true across the board, pretty much.
Yeah, and I think in terms of mass shootings, I think one of the things that certainly contributes to mass shootings is assault weapons,
Hmm.
right? It's no surprise that when you see these mass shootings, that the weapon of choice is an AR-15 or other
Hmm.
type similar weapon. These are weapons that were designed for war. They were
Hmm.
designed off of platforms, guns that were used in the Korean, in the
Yeah, these were never intended for
yeah,
deer hunting or target shooting.
no,
These were made.
these are weapons that were really designed for warfare.
Mhm.
They're the 223 round is a round that is designed to create destroy the human body,
Yeah.
right? And I've seen and heard and met surgeons describe what they have to deal with when they are treating a patient that has been shot
Yeah.
with a 223 round by bullets that come out of an AR-15, and it is devastating.
Yeah.
It is some you can it is hard to save people that have been where tissue and bone have been destroyed in such a
Yeah.
way, and that is the design of the weapon.
Yeah.
So I think, look, if you want to reduce shootings with AR-15s, ban assault weapons,
Yeah.
right? It is the weapon of choice amongst these mass shooters. I think everything else, I think you have to attack it from many different angles. I think you
Mhm.
have to take a very holistic approach to gun violence. One thing alone is not going to end gun violence. You need
Yeah.
to look at permitting systems that work. You have to look at extreme risk protection orders that work. You have to look at educating the public,
Mhm.
background checks, reducing lethality of weapons,
Yeah.
making sure that age is a factor, right?
Mhm.
That you keep the guns out of the hands of people that are most likely to harm themselves,
Yeah.
right? So getting mental health services for vulnerable people like
Mhm.
veterans, right?
Mhm.
Like police officers, and making sure that there's appropriate services for people like that. So,
Yeah.
and I think all of these things have to work. It can't just be one thing and not another.
In the wake of a lot of this kind of rise in violence over the last few years, both the governor and CCM have kind of come out with appeals for change. But first, let's talk about the state's proposals. What was in there from the governor, and what do you wish was there?
I think the governor's done an excellent job of looking at this issue, and as I just stated, and kind of taking a holistic approach to this. So
Mhm.
there's a lot in the bill that and specifically safe storage is part of the
Mhm.
governor's bill, and making sure that we that people lock up their guns regardless of who's in there. The governor also made sure that this statewide commission, that DPH has funding for another year, that there
Mhm.
and the governor is proposing another $2.9 million of funding. Ghost gun ban, increasing the ghost gun
Mhm.
ban, and tightening up some of these loopholes. Where I think that, so I do applaud the governor for all the work that he and his staff have done to
Mhm.
look at this in a really meaningful way, and to look at legislation around the country and what's happening at the national level, and to see where we can be stronger as a state.
Mhm.
And Connecticut does have strong gun laws. Where we can improve, I think $2.9 million in funding could be increased.
Mhm.
And I think it's right now we spend over $1 billion every year on the aftermath of gun violence.
Yeah.
We see other states spending a little more or a lot more on gun violence prevention measures. And if we look at all the per capita spending, and we look at what's being spent around the country, it probably makes sense to raise that $2.9 million to something
Mhm.
closer to $10 million a year.
Yeah.
The second thing I think is probably we would like to see the legislature do is, right now the governor's proposal is ARPA funding, and it's only for year one of the
Mhm.
next budget. We would like to see that continue for year two as well. So there should be at least a $2.9 million fund in year two, to make
Mhm.
sure that there isn't a funding cliff, that DPH has the money to uh, to to get to these organizations, make sure that we are also studying what we're spending,
Yeah.
and to make sure that there is accountability in spending,
Mhm.
and if it's working, we should continue to spend it. If it isn't working, then we have to kind of go back to the drawing board and see what we should be spending. But this is
Yeah.
one of the most important things that we should be doing is making sure that we're studying this issue and making sure that these organizations that we are funding, that we're looking at to see whether or not it's effective. So, I think that when we may not see results overnight, this is a long-term strategy.
Yeah.
We may not see results for 2, 3, 5 years. But I do think that could be increased, as well as making sure that there is funding for year 2 of the budget.
Yeah.
The other thing that we're asking the legislators to do in terms of the ghost gun bill is that we do think that the bill could be a little stronger in that right now, and this is kind of technical, but the lower receiver, the kind of the lower part of the gun, is not considered a firearm under federal or state law. It's only really the upper receiver where the serial number is, and that allows a loophole, right? That allows gun parts to be shipped into our state where they normally wouldn't be allowed to be shipped, and unless you had a federal firearm.
So you get something to ship to you, and it's missing the one upper part that would make it officially a gun. And they put it on that one part, and now it isn't, but they didn't treat it as such because it didn't have that part. Is that kind of what
Yeah, so like if you have the lower part of the gun and it's called the lower receiver, that under federal law is not considered a firearm.
Okay.
Even though it has the grip, the trigger guard, the lower part of the slide, and
it's really easy to then put the other part onto that.
Exactly. So if you're and the whole idea is this: it's not so much to say, hey, you can't, if you have a gun license and a permit and a background check, that you can't build your own gun. It's really saying, look, if we're going to have all these laws in place in Connecticut, then why shouldn't those same laws apply to building your own gun as they would for buying your own gun? And so that's it. So if you're going to require people to have a background check, training, a permit, to be 21 to buy a handgun, then that should also apply to the parts of the handgun, right? And so
be able to get around it by shipping it in 2 boxes instead of 1.
So if you need a license if you need a federal firearms license to buy a gun online and to be able to have it shipped to you, then the same laws should apply to any of the parts of that gun, especially the lower receiver, like a main part of that gun. And so, look, get a permit, get a background check, go through all. If you want a federal firearms license, you can do that, and that will enable you to do all of these things. And there's no prohibition. There's just more hoops that you might have to jump through. But until we do that, we're opening up a massive loophole to allow people who can't get a firearm legally, right? Because that's what's happening right now, is that people who can't get a permit or can't obtain guns legally, whether because they're dangerous felons or they have protective orders or they're abusive spouses or whatever, they're not able to have a gun. And now we're allowing people to go online, buy an unfinished receiver, build it in their own home. And now we're also seeing an industry created by this. We're seeing people set up homemade manufacturing plants in their basement. I think it was Bethel. I'm not quite sure, but I think it was last year. There was a bust where someone was manufacturing ghost guns in their basement and selling them on the illegal market. Right. This is something very easy. We shouldn't allow. If we're going to have all these laws that govern who can manufacture guns, who can have them, then why are we now allowing people to buy the parts to then set up their own shop when they can't do it legally?
Now, is this a relatively recent problem with the ghost guns? Is this something like a loophole that got figured out after some other laws got passed, that people had figured this out as a way to get around newer laws, or has this been going on for a long time?
It's been going on for a while now, but certainly in the last couple of years, it has taken on more of a problem. And so back in 2017, was kind of the beginning of when the ATF, and particularly in California, was becoming a problem. They started to see more ghost guns, and it probably was even earlier than that. But back in 2017, the ATF, just give an example of how much this has increased. The ATF, they traced and tracked how many ghost guns they've recovered, and in 2017, it was about 1,600 ghost guns that they recovered. And in 2021, they, from 2017 to 2021, that number increased from 1,600 to 19,000.
Jeez.
So during that time, the ATF saw an increase of, I think it's like over 1,000%. And even anecdotally, when I'm on a call with New Haven Police, Comstat hearings, where they go over every month, what violence looks like in New Haven, we always hear an increase in the number of ghost guns that they've recovered. This is a problem. And oddly enough, back in 2017, when we tried to introduce this law, and it was actually William Tong, our Attorney General, that was the head of the judiciary at that time. He was the chair of the Judiciary Committee. He was one of the first, if not the first person to say, like, in Connecticut, hey, this is a problem. We need to do something about it, and introduce the ghost gun ban, which we helped to pass. But at that time, nobody, everybody kind of looked at us like we were crazy, like a ghost gun. They thought it was like a catchphrase, and like, this is ridiculous. It's not a problem here. Like, nobody really had heard of it. They thought, and now it is a huge problem. It's so much of a problem that this is like one of the main things that the ATF is focusing on. It's one of the things that Biden administration is focusing on. And certainly in Connecticut, the law enforcement is trying to figure out how to make sure that they are eliminating this newer source of illegal guns.
And so where are they coming? Like, the people that are putting them together and selling them, where are they getting their stuff from? And is that kind of how you try to prevent it? Is the manufacturers that are selling the parts to them, or how do you tackle something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea is to, most of these are sold online. You can go online now. You can go to like ghostguns.com and you can see for yourself, and they'll send you unfinished receivers. They'll send you all the parts, and then they'll also send you a link for a YouTube video of how to kind of shave off
how to put it all together.
Right. And drill out some of the holes and use a Dremel. And so this is where people again are mostly online, or they're it's not gun manufacturers that are sending out ghost guns. They don't have an interest in doing that. If Ruger is selling their own guns,
money on the finish, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, and which is interesting, because it's odd that the gun manufacturers haven't been more active in trying to prevent ghost guns, because it's in their best interest, right? Why would a company like Colt or Ruger, why wouldn't they want a ghost gun ban? I mean, it's like
the manufacturers not wanting the fake purses out there and things like that.
Exactly right. It doesn't make any sense that they haven't been more active, which sort of speaks of the culture of guns, right? And how tribal this has really become. It's about it's no longer about safety. It's really become this political issue, right? Over politicized. And so people are now running on whether or not they're good on gun violence, or whether they support the NRA. And so and it's unfortunate, because it really isn't about politics. It shouldn't be about politics. It's really about safety. It's really about saving lives.
So at CCM, we recently convened a task force on gun violence, which we ultimately focused on kind of repeat offenders, which is a very narrow focus, but one that we think there's a possibility for a big impact. Have you come across any of these statistics that repeat offenders, even sometimes on bail, are responsible for a lot of the gun violence?
Yeah, I mean, it's been something. This is not new. This is something that has also been studied, and the National Network and John Jay University and David Kennedy and others have been studying this for years. And there's a whole, when we talked earlier about different forms of gun violence, well, one of the initiatives to reduce gun violence, especially in our cities, is group violence intervention, or like what they call problem-oriented policing, right? And so it's the idea is not to just put a wide net out. It's to be very strategic about where you're going to send the police, how you're going to prosecute cases, and who you're going to target. And so there are initiatives like Project Longevity that have been around for a very long time in Connecticut. And they are, they are group violence oriented. And so the idea is that they are targeting, they're focusing on certain individuals and certain groups of individuals that they feel are most responsible for gun violence. And the idea is to simultaneously make sure that you're enforcing the laws and enforcing and directing enforcement and prosecutions towards those groups that are most likely to cause the violence, but also that are actually causing the violence. But at the same time, offering them services, right? And so offering them an alternative to say, okay, look, we know who you are, we know who you associate with, and we know what you've done. And here's some targeted prosecutions that we've done in the past, and it didn't work so great for them. They're now serving time in federal penitentiaries. However, organizations like Project Longevity, they will also help you to, they'll offer you services and help you get your driver's license or your CDL, or or help you write a resume. And so the idea is to offer you services that can help better your life so that you don't necessarily have to resort to gun violence.
So that doesn't seem like the better option, the crime or the whatever it is that they're getting involved in.
Exactly. And so the approach is to offer them a different way out, So, and I think for, and for gun violence, there are certainly populations of people who perpetrate gun violence where it is a life or death situation, but it is also, they don't carry the gun because they woke up one day and said, I want to carry a gun. They, people feel like this is necessary to live. Yeah. Right. However, also in these communities, there are a lot of beefs. There's a lot of gun violence that is just kind of tit for tat. Right. It's somebody shot my friend and now I have to retaliate.
Yeah, I know here in New Haven, there was an organization that actually went by, I believe, Ice the Beef was kind of their thing. And it was an organization looking to kind of quell some of those neighborhood or gang-based sort of issues between people, and was.
Yeah, and I think, organizations like Connecticut Violence Intervention Program, also in New Haven, Letter Jihad runs, the idea is to prevent it from happening, it's to intervene, right? It's to intervene with a group, whether it's at the hospital right after the shooting happened or in the community, to make sure that these, that there is a de-escalation, that there is another way to resort your differences, because we know what's going to happen, right? What that famous phrase of like, if everyone resorted to an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the whole world would be, blind and toothless, right? Yeah. So these organizations, and there's lots of them in Connecticut that are trying to intervene at the community level, and a lot of times starting from the hospital where right after a shooting happens, or at a funeral, and so but the idea is that there certainly is a lot of data out there that a lot of gun violence, especially community gun violence, is being perpetrated by a very small number of people. And it's similar analogy is, we have a lot of guns in the United States, but there's a lot of guns owned by a minority of people. It's not everyone that has a gun. It's that there are a lot of people that have a lot of guns. So I think whatever the approach is, whether we're looking at increased prosecution or making sure that people are held accountable, or reducing increasing sentences or truth in sentencing, making sure that people serve whatever sentence the judge issued. I think that's complicated, right? And I think that there is definitely room for improvement. What we would like to see, and we want to make sure, and we do applaud CCM for putting this in the proposal, is that it's just one of many different solutions, right? This is just one of the legs of the stool, if you will, right? So we did appreciate, and that CCM did put in their proposal that funding, right? That funding community violence intervention and prevention is still something that has to be a priority, right? It can't just be, and so making sure you're tough on crime or prosecution isn't the only way. It's make sure that we're also investing in our communities. And so we are grateful, and hope that there's appropriations hearing on the 28th tomorrow, and we're hoping we get a great turnout tomorrow to be able to convince legislators to fund these types of programs and to make sure that we are funding
Yeah.
other solutions outside of law enforcement as well.
Yeah. So I guess in closing, even at a time when gun violence is on the rise, seems very high, are you optimistic about our ability to stem gun violence or at least bring it back to pre-pandemic levels? Are you feeling optimistic about the state of Connecticut?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've seen dramatic decreases in gun violence right after Sandy Hook, after some of the strongest gun laws were enacted. We've seen other decreases. We've seen cities like Bridgeport see a decrease in gun violence even throughout the pandemic. And now we're trying to figure out why that is, and then if we can bottle it, we
Hmm.
will. But look, gun violence is very complicated, and it's not a one size fits all solution.
Hmm.
We've been working very closely with the city of New Haven to try to create a blueprint for their Office of Violence Prevention. We're going to be
Hmm.
working with the city of Bridgeport to see if we can do something similar. But it takes everyone, all hands on deck, public health experts, police, legislators, community members, right?
Hmm.
Because we can't do this without the community. And to make sure we're studying this like any other public health crisis. But yes, I am extremely optimistic. We know gun laws work.
Hmm.
We know that those states that have the lowest gun death rate also tend to have the strongest gun laws.
Hmm.
Connecticut has some of the strongest gun laws in the country, and we have, I think we're like somewhere between third and fifth lowest gun death rate in the
Hmm.
country. Other similar states that have very strong gun laws, like New York and Massachusetts. Massachusetts has the lowest gun death rate in the country and
Yeah.
has some of the strongest gun laws. So and then you look at the converse. You look at places like Florida, and you look at other states that have very weak gun laws, and
Hmm.
and places like that have a lot of gun death.
Yeah.
And also places like Florida saw an increase in mass shootings,
Yeah.
and so we are very hopeful, and we're grateful in Connecticut, for organizations like CCM and others, and we have a strong governor, and we have great legislators that take gun violence seriously and make this a
Yeah.
priority. And so I think working together, all different aspects of government, the public, and researchers,
Hmm.
I am hopeful that we can really end gun violence in Connecticut and be a model for the rest of the country, as we've done over the last 30 years.
Great. And if someone listening at home wanted to learn more or was interested in maybe volunteering or helping out, how would they go about doing that?
Sure. We have a website,
Hmm.
chv.org. You can go onto our Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. I think we have a TikTok
All of the
site,
above.
all the above. I think the best way is to go on and sign up to receive updates. We don't send a
Hmm.
lot, but what it does, it gets you connected. It gets you connected to know what is happening in your community, what is happening at the state level, who's running for office, what are some issues you should be paying attention to, and then just show up, come out. There's plenty to be done, plenty of different ways that people can get involved. Not everyone wants to come to the Capitol and
Yeah.
testify or march. And then if you're listening, just tell your friend, tell your neighbor, tell your husband, like what you heard today.
Hmm.
Um, be educated, understand what gun violence really means and how we are all really susceptible to it, where no one is immune from this,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Well, Jeremy Stein with Connecticut Against Gun Violence, thank you so much for speaking with us today about this important issue.
Yeah, Matt, I really appreciate you having us here, and let me know if there's ever anything else we can do for you or CCM, and we're grateful to be here.
We'd like to thank our guest, Jeremy Stein. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer. Christopher Gilson is our producer. Harry Draws is on the boards. And I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like. And watch out for a CCM chat series on our YouTube page.